Daro, who is the next speaker. She's an associate professor and research fellow at the Chapin Hall Center for Children at the University of Chicago, and has immense experience, among others, as the director of the National Center on Child Abuse Prevention Research in the US, and on the program of the National Committee to Prevent Child Abuse in the US, where she contributed to the development of Healthy Families America. So I think we have somebody who brings immense experience and whose experience will complement very nicely Cassie's review of the science. Over to you, Deborah.
Thank you so much. This is on, yeah. I want to thank you all for your attention and patience. I come from a perspective of my own country and what we've done, but also for years of working with the International Society to Prevent Child Abuse. Not working. So, oops.
Can you use this? You want to change it? Come.
Yeah, why don't you sit here, Deborah? I'll scoot down. I can scoot down.
Okay. A little change. That's exactly right. Okay. Yeah. All right.
We'll give you an extra 30 seconds for that.
Thanks. That's what I wanted. But for my work with the International Society to Prevent Child Abuse, where we have learned over the years that every context, every community contributes to our collective knowledge of trying to do better. None of us have the secret keys to the kingdom. None of us have solved the problem. But it's in sharing our lessons learned that I think we can make real progress for all children in all circumstances. If I can have the next slide. There are 4 main points I'm going to talk about, many of which will reinforce what Dr. Landers has been talking about in terms of the research and the science about early childhood. The first is to keep in mind that the positive experiences in early childhood are fundamental to healthy development. Children need to get off to a good start. Second, that when children experience familial or contextual violence early in their lives, that disrupts the developmental process in profound ways. Third, home visitation has emerged as an effective strategy to prevent violence and strengthen key protective factors. Home visitation can't stop all negative experiences for children, but we can strengthen both parents and through other interventions the community to compensate for those negative experiences children might have. And that thirdly, effective violence prevention requires not just more programs, but really thinking beyond programs and beginning to change the context in which programs and families operate. The next slide. This is just reinforcing what we already know. The most fundamental part of development are the first few years. Think of it like building a building. You don't start building the building on the top floor. You start with the foundation. And early childhood is fundamental to everything a child will do later. Good skills early in life lead to arriving at school ready to learn, lead to succeeding in school and whatever choices children and their parents may make, to being contributors, productive members of society, to having a full and healthy, productive life. When the foundation is cracked, or the foundation is not fully developed, the outcomes are less predictable. The next slide. These next 2 slides are just simple, basic understandings about child development that Cassie talked about a good deal. They're reflected in the From Neurons to Neighborhoods publication that was published in the US in 2000. And it really is very simple. It's about the dynamic and continuous interplay between nature and nurture. It's not just genes, it's not just context, it's the interaction between both. It's about cultural influences on every aspect of parenting. I like to think as hard as we try, one day you wake up and you're your mother. You are simply doing, in many ways, translating what you experienced in your own childhood. Third, that self-regulation, the ability of a child to focus on a particular mission and goal in the light of a lot of distractions, is fundamental to their successful development. That children are active participants. No one knows this better than the World Health Organization. We want to know what children need or desire. We need to ask them and listen to them and work with them in their own development. That positive and consistent human relationships are the building blocks of healthy development. We interact with individuals who give us our definition in many ways of who we are and our expectations about what to expect from others. The next slide. There is wide variation in how children develop. Not everybody does it the same way on the same time frame. That's okay, and we need to be adaptable to that. Each child will follow his or her own developmental pathway. Human development is in many ways a reflection of ongoing interaction between risk and protective factors. We talk a lot about the risks that children face. Children can often overcome those risks if there are certain protective factors, something going well in their life. So when we seek to intervene, it's not just to avoid the worst, but it's to nurture and develop the best. Early experiences matter the most for children, for all of us, but it's not the determinant of what a child will be. There are other opportunities, it's just more difficult and more challenging. And finally, I think early intervention can make a difference. We know that if we're intentional about the programs we develop for families and children and communities, we can indeed produce better outcomes. Next slide, please. So what do we want in the birth to 5 period? Well, we want children to be raised in familial and community environments, as Cassie mentioned, that promote safety, stability, nurturing, and appropriate stimulation and early learning opportunities. If those conditions aren't met, it's very hard to imagine how a child develops in a safe and predictable way. We want to avoid preventable illnesses and injury. And from the perspective that I work from, we want to avoid, oops, just turn that away, go away. We want to avoid abusive and neglectful behavior wherever that comes, whether it comes from within the family or within the community. So what are the kinds of things that parents have, the attributes of parents, that make these developmental outcomes more likely? Well, when parents are sensitive and responsive caregivers, provide individualized teaching to their child, that helps a child develop in a positive way. When parents provide appropriate choices for children and guidance in decision making, they introduce children to an appropriate level of choice and then teach them that that's what life is often about, choosing A or B, and doing it because you understand of the logical consequences of those two choices. It's about providing environments where you give effective support for early emotional regulation of the child. You teach your child when to be patient. You teach your child when to express appropriate frustration. You help your child understand that often you don't get everything you want when you want it, but you will, if you're intentional and focused, get many things that you want under the conditions that you do want them. Parents that have consistent and appropriate supervision that encourage emerging skills and challenges. You don't want, we call the hovering parent, I don't know if that's a concept here, a parent who decides everything for their child, they never leave their child, they're frightful if their child does anything. That child's going to get a very different message about what's appropriate exploration. So one of the challenges parents have, and effective parents learn this, is when to let your child take appropriate risk. And maybe they'll fall down, but they won't get hurt. But they're going to learn from the falling down experience. That can be difficult for parents that don't understand the notion of appropriate risk-taking themselves. The next slide. So what makes for a supportive context? What kinds of neighborhoods produce the types of children that we know will develop into healthy adults? Well, those neighborhoods provide a pool, a large number of available adults to support children. As a parent, I don't take credit for every good thing my child does because I don't want to take the blame if they do something wrong. I think that that's important to understand, that children are a function of not just their relationship with their parent, but by the experience of every adult that touches their lives. Every adult leaves an imprint on every child they come across. So a community that offers adults that give positive imprints on children are going to be more helpful to parents than communities that don't provide that. We know that we want to offer an array of opportunities for physical growth and development. Supportive communities are areas where there's safe places for children to play. There's strong community institutions in which children can get helped and nurtured. Strong communities also provide instrumental and emotional support to families. They're communities in which neighbors interact with each other, people provide assistance for casual child care and responsibilities, and you also know that you can, again, trust your neighbors or community to provide a safe context for your child if you're not there. Next slide, please. So what are the realities when parents are abusive or neglectful? There are parents that don't understand basic child development. So they don't know if their child's developing on task or if there's a problem because they don't understand fully what accurate development is about. There are parents that have limited skills in basic child care and nurturing. They may be simply so overwhelmed that they can't focus on their own child rearing, but it also may be a situation in which, again, the knowledge is not there. They themselves didn't experience positive upbringing as children. They don't have the knowledge and tools to pass that on to their children. Abusive families suffer from poor impulse control, social isolation, and often have high stress, the kind of toxic stress that Cassie was talking about, not the positive stress, but stress due to young maternal age, single parent status, and poverty. And for some, not all, but for some parents, it's a reflection of serious mental health issues, domestic violence, or substance abuse. Now, what do dangerous communities look like? Well, there's physical dangers in them. They're unsafe. There can be violence, whether it's gang war, gun violence, and the like. There's high levels of interpersonal violence. These are communities in which people battle with each other, that are not supportive, they're not patient. There's limited social capital and collective efficacy. Neighbors don't work together. There's poor quality or limited public services. And overall, it's an ecological climate that does little to compensate for the shortcomings in parental capacity. None of us have what it takes all the time to be supportive, positive parents. We rely on other people to pick up the load when we can't do it. Imagine you're in a community where there's no one to pick up the load. There's no one to help. Then you can quickly see how abuse and neglect can surface. So why early intervention? Why, if it's an obvious, other than we know early childhood is important, what is it about early intervention that seems to have taken on in many communities around the world? Certainly, Cassie talked about the brain research, but it's more than the science. It's the accessibility of the science to everyday individuals. You don't need to be a scientist to understand that this is important. In fact, I think everyone who has ever parented a child gets that the first few years of life are important. We don't need a lecture about it. We don't need a brain diagram about it. We know that what happens with a young child is going to affect their lives going forward. Second, there's strong longitudinal research on the high return on investment from working with early childhood. I don't think public policy should always be guided by what gives us the best return on investment, because sometimes you need to do things even if it's not going to pay back big dividends in the short term. But this is one case where it is so obvious. If you invest now, it's like compound interest. You invest now, it gets a little better at the next stage. That lets it get a little better later on. It's a good investment of public dollars and individual resources. There is, with early intervention, a strong conceptual fit to what we've learned about how to prevent all forms of violence, particularly familial violence. If you want to change the trajectory of a problem, you need to start early. And when we're talking about child development, the earliest years are the most important place. Finally, I think we turned to early intervention, at least in the prevention field, because we were so disappointed about what our current efforts were yielding in the early 1980s. We had lots of programs, but no result. And I think in part, it was because we were building the building at all floors at one time, and we ignored the foundation. So starting with early childhood became fundamental, not just for a child's development, but for the development of effective and successful public policy and practices. Next slide. So why home visitation? I think it was what I call a perfect storm. We did home visitation because the research told us we should do it. It was promising. Practitioners, people that deliver service, were saying, I think this works. And then finally, at least in the United States, public policy, legislators, governments wanted to invest in it. So we had a strong idea with a good research base, an idea that people that delivered service liked, and somebody with money that wanted to invest in it. So it became, in many ways, the cornerstone of what we're doing in early childhood. Now, whether it should be the only tool in the toolkit is a question I think we'll talk about for the next 2 days. But that it is an important tool is something I think we all realize. And we liked home visitation also because it gives us a window or opening to working with those families that are most troubled. Too often, prevention involves putting up a sign that says, "Come to me and I'll help you." That's hard for many people to do. Home visitation goes to the family. It takes the service directly to where the family lives, and in that way, it gives us a new window of opportunity to reach families that are more at risk. It shapes the services based on the individual context and needs of each family. It can be one-on-one. It can tailor what you want, your message, to those families that need it. It can engage other family members that will be in the home that we know are very important. And it models relationship building. Remember, early childhood is a lot about relationships. This program shows a new mom, a new dad, who may not have a long history of good relationships, what a good relationship looks like. So what makes for the best models? Cassie touched on this. I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think are important, not just for home visitation, but for any of you developing any program. First and foremost, it needs to have strong theoretical integrity. It needs to know where it's going and have a clear pathway for getting there. It needs to focus at the earliest stages of the problem development. I think programs need to employ persistent but respectful outreach methods so that you're always reaching to a family saying, what can I do? And offer them not one opportunity to engage in your service, but multiple opportunities. Because sometimes you'll go one time and the family may not be ready for you. So you go back again until it's a good fit for the family, for them to accept you into their lives. You need to provide some systematic assessment of a wide range of needs. It's not that you'll solve all those needs with your program, but we need to understand that the pathways families follow to get to a particular outcome is diverse, and we need to understand all the pathways families are on to maximize our results. And then finally, I think we need to provide individual families access to other services that may be in our community. Next slide. So what do the best models accomplish? Well, list of outcomes, and they're very close to what we say needs to happen for positive child development. Better birth outcomes, better parent-child relationships, and the like. As a child develops, stronger literacy skills and social competence. So next slide. So if we look at home visitation and violence prevention, there are a number of factors both in the family and the community that home visitation can help. But there are a number of other factors home visitation is insufficient to resolve. The issues of serious poor functioning on the part of the family, substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence. And more important for me is that home visitation alone can't really address the contextual issues that we know make it difficult to raise parents. One of the most troubling aspects to me in the field right now is our continued belief that some parents need help and other parents don't. I don't know about you, but I needed a lot of help when I had my children. It wasn't just that I had an education and a supportive family and resources. I wasn't as prepared as I needed to be for the challenges of working with an infant, and the realization that that was going to be my job for the rest of my life. You're never not a parent. Even when they leave home, you're never not a parent. We all need help. And the more we try to say, there are these good parents over here that can do it on their own, and then these bad parents that just can't matter. I think we need to break that. And what I focus on is what I call the circular debate in prevention. We want to be efficient in how we spend money, so we target our services to only those we think need them. But then we get concerned that we're stigmatizing those parents, because often the targeted programs go to low-income families, minority families, families that are somehow marginalized in their respective societies. So to break the stigmatization, we do universal programs, and then we get worried about not being efficient. So we get into this circular process that I think it's now time to get out of it and to adapt a public health model, which says you do some universal, and then within the universal, you target services to families that are most at risk. So what are some of the limits of a targeted scientific approach? I think it requires a highly predictive and accurate risk assessment tool. We have to know that we can accurately identify those families who are having trouble, and that we assume that we'll always know who the families are by the use of this tool. I think that's highly suspect, because families change over time and relative levels of risk will change accordingly. We have to assume that if we target families, they'll come to our programs for some reason. I mean, can you imagine going to a family saying, I've identified you as having a problem, now I want to serve you, but I really want to help you. Families look at that and say, well, you just said that I have a problem, so how can you be that opening and engaging for me when you've already said you think I'm going to fail? I think the targeted medicine does reinforce the message I was telling you earlier, that it's some families need help, many families don't. And then finally, this approach assumes that if we just had the right program, if we just had the right intervention, we did it often enough, we get the outcomes we want. And I think that that's the fundamental problem we're struggling with. It is beyond model. It is really improving the context in which children and families live. And more importantly than improving context, it's also saying, what is it in this community that strengthens families? What is it in this community that we can use to build more effective interventions. So a universal alternative is really about creating an integrated network of universal and targeted services, a preventive system of care that builds on a core set of universal needs. There is certainly variability in how children develop and how parents care for their children, but there is a consistent need and focus on getting all children off to a good start. We have to tailor the message to the interest of specific groups of new parents. We need to establish explicit linkages to efforts to serve the highest risk families with the most services. We need to focus on teaching parents consumer skills, how to make those choices so that when they go out and they're no longer in the program, they're still going to make new, good, effective services for their children and for themselves. And then finally, we need to extend home-based interventions to other points in a child's developmental continuum. It's good to get children off to a good start, but then we have to think about every step and stage of the building. I wanted to end with, this is good, 2 quotes by 2 people that I admired greatly and learned a great deal from in my own work. The first is from Henry Kemp, the modern father of our child abuse prevention movement. And it speaks to the question I just raised about universality. Henry wrote, "Will the health visitor be seen as someone who can be truly useful and accepted like a member of the old, lamented, extended family? I believe that to a large extent, this will depend upon whether the program is started for all people, rich or poor, black or white, brown or red, or whether it is limited once again to the disadvantaged or the minorities. To my mind, only a universal program will develop with quality and be successful. My colleagues at Chapin Hall have a phrase that sometimes programs that are only for poor families, poor children, tend to be poor programs. We don't invest enough resources in programs that we think are only going to help the disadvantaged. When a program has a universal appeal and a universal touch, not the same touch for everyone, but everyone sees a benefit and need, those programs get better investments and they have more staying power in times of political and financial uncertainty. Second, finally, in addition to going universal, it's equally important to think about the long-term developmental trajectory of children. Ed Ziegler, who's the father of our Head Start program in the US, wrote many years ago that it is shocking that so many have chosen to focus on 1 year or 2 when the child was a preschooler and have disregarded the many subsequent years of development, exalted a singular experience over myriad others, and are now putting their hopes and money on early childhood programs as the solution, not part of a solution to pervasive social problems. The issues that trouble us most as a society are not just in our families, but in the fabric and culture and the values in which we've established for ourselves. If we try to only fix families without dealing with the other issues, we are indeed doomed to failure. The beauty of this meeting is that every presenter you're going to hear from understands this message and will be reinforcing it throughout the next day and a half. So thank you so much for your time.